Chapter 1. The Garden Party's Quiet Bloom. The morning had arrived in Little Renford with that peculiar stillness that gives the impression the village itself was holding its breath. The hedgerows, neat enough to be admired in the county register of well-kept cottages, glistened with the remains of an early mist. Pansies and foxgloves had been arranged with careful casualness along the gravel path leading to the vicarage lawn, where the annual summer garden party was unfolding with the leisurely confidence of long habit. White lace parasols fluttered like hesitant moths above gossiping clusters, and the tea-urn steamed in sympathy with the soft warp of conversation. It was the sort of event where nothing unusual ever happened, where the same faces appeared each year, trading the same gentle barbs about the weather, about the vicar's inevitably late arrival, about the new schoolmistress's boldness in planting roses too near the path. Yet beneath the easy laughter and polite compliments, a lattice of old grievances, unspoken alliances, and half-remembered slights thrummed, as delicate and taut as the lace covering on the sandwiches. Miss Marple had come not as a heroine summoned by crisis, but as a welcome guest, slipping into the scene with the ease of one who knew the rhythm of village life like the back of her own well-thumbed knitting pattern. She was seated near the lower terrace, a cup of weak tea balanced on her knee, her hands folded as if in prayer, though it was more the posture of someone listening than someone devout. Her smile, soft and feathery, was the sort of thing that encouraged confidences without seeming to seek them, and the steady, unhurried gaze she turned in various directions caught more than the casual observer would have guessed. She watched, not with the intensity of those who sought drama, but with the patient curiosity of one who understands that the smallest motions often tell the fullest stories. A tremor in a laugh, the way two old friends exchanged glances when mentioning a third. How the new gardener, Mr. Hargreaves, insisted on stirring his tea clockwise twice, then counterclockwise once, as if to cover a misstep. These were small ripples across a wide, placid pond, and Miss Marple knew that sooner or later something would be thrown in. The vicar, Reverend Peregrine Ashdown, arrived with his usual flourish of apologies and a slightly disheveled bow tie, which he later claimed had been rescued from a rebellious breeze. He had a talent for making tardiness appear ritual rather than lapse, and everyone, with that soft English indulgence, let it pass as a part of the day's charm. Behind him came the new schoolmistress, Miss Lillian Graves, her expression both eager and watchful, carrying a basket of freshly baked scones. She was the sort of person who came to a village with ambitions neatly pinned beneath her sensible hat, and the older women had already begun to divide her into categories: promising, inquisitive, troublesome, or the sort of person who might, if left unchecked, upset a few careful arrangements. A group gathered around the wicker table near the rose pergola. Lady Penelope Ashcroft, recently returned from a season in the city, was the bright nucleus. Her presence, simultaneously, an adornment and a small earthquake. She spoke animatedly of developments in town, of fashions, of a scandal in a neighboring parish, which she shared with the delighted, hushed relish of a person who felt the need to justify her own return to quiet life by reminding others of what she had survived. Her younger brother, Gerald Ashcroft, sat with a languid ease that suggested either a deep contentment or practiced disinterest. He was on that rare cusp where charm could curdle into insolence if looked at too long. It was in the midst of these ordinary exchanges that the first fissure appeared, not as a cry or as an overt accusation, but in the slow settling of silence when the gardener, Mr. Hargreaves, looked toward the walled end of the garden, and, for a moment, forgot to smile. His hands, large and usually so steady from years of pruning, tightened around the tea saucer. Miss Marple saw it, and the corners of her mouth shifted, faint as a thread pulled taut. "Is that the new gate?" asked Mrs. Fenn, the baker's wife, leaning close to Miss Marple so that her breath carried a faint scent of cinnamon. "I heard the Ashcrofts had it repaired. The stones were a little loose, weren't they? Gerald insisted on someone from the city doing it, as if the village craftsmen weren't good enough." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "City hands sometimes leave their own footprints in the work," she said, sounding as if she were musing about the color of the roses. "But a gate is like a promise. If it's not made to fit, it squeaks. People notice those sounds if you make them listen." Mrs. Fenn nodded, pleased with the small, corroborated truth. "Yes, yes, and the Ashcrofts have been so particular of late. It is like everything is being polished to hide something under the shine. Polish doesn't mend a crack," murmured the vicar as he passed, and the remark, though casual, rested over the group like a soft shadow. Miss Marple's attention, however, shifted once more. At the far end of the garden, where the yew hedge met the stone wall, a young man in his late 20s, Mr. Timothy Waller, a solicitor's clerk from the next village, visiting, as he sometimes did to consult with Lady Penelope on her estate matters, had stepped away from the group. He had an air of someone who carried his own private list of grievances quietly folded in his pocket. He bent with a careful, almost reluctant motion to examine a small cleft in the wall, one that had been previously dismissed by the others as a harmless old fissure. No one watched him closely. He seemed to be doing nothing more than tracing the pattern of weathered mortar with his thumb. Yet Miss Marple noted the way his lips moved, as if forming silent questions, the slight hitch when he rose, and the way he adjusted his cuff with a touch that betrayed nervousness he meant to conceal. The party moved on, laughter filling crevices where unease might otherwise have crept in. Children chased each other between the flower beds, their shrieks of delight a familiar chorus, while the elderly sat in their accustomed chairs, puffing gently and commenting on the heat. The innocence of the scene, the seeming continuity of tradition and calm, wrapped itself around the morning like a well-sewn coverlet. It was then that the unexpected anomaly occurred. The soft, contented murmur of voices dulled, as if sound had been gently drawn away, and from the direction of the pergola came a half-choked exclamation that fluttered like a dropped handkerchief through the air. Miss Marple's head turned, but she did not rise. Her knitting, thin strands of green wool, rested on her lap, half-finished. Her fingers did not move yet. She had not been startled. She was merely acknowledging that a new pattern had formed, one that required observation. Lady Penelope's face had gone the peculiar pale that came upon her in contradiction to her habitual flair. She was standing rigid, the teacup in her hand momentarily suspended, as if she had forgotten the weight of porcelain. On the table beneath the pergola, the delicate lace cloth had been disturbed, not by wind, but by the subtle drag of something heavy having been set down in haste. Gerald Ashcroft, who had been leaning back with a light-hearted remark ready on his tongue, had frozen. His eyes, which had been focused on a distant memory of a youth too easily wasted, now sharpened. "It's Mrs. Cartwright," hissed a voice. "She's gone all faint." She was speaking of the new vicar's sermon, and then she just— Miss Marple's gaze slid to the cause. On the edge of the pergola's shadow, half seated, half collapsed, was the elderly Mrs. Cartwright, once the headmistress of the village school, a woman whose discipline had shaped half the women present. Her hands trembled, her eyes fluttered beneath thin lids, and pressed to her chest was a small, leather-bound diary, the corner of it peeking as if it wanted to speak. Her hat, pinned with the same black silk ribbon she had worn for decades, was askew. No one had seen her approach. She had been laughing moments earlier about a slight to her baking from the previous year. Reverend Ashdown was already on his feet, a gentle but brisk hand guiding a young assistant to fetch brandy. Gerald stepped forward, his expression caught between concern and impatience. Miss Lillian Graves, with the practical instinct of someone unused to the soft cushions of village life, had already moved to help, fingers adjusting the collar of Mrs. Cartwright's blouse with a tentative tenderness that felt new to her. Miss Marple, however, remained seated. She had noticed, in the small ripple of the event before the cry, Timothy Waller's furtive glance toward the stone wall, the young man's unsettled adjustment of his cuff, the way the diary's edge had caught the light as if aware of its own importance. Her listening was not passive. She had heard a breath held, then released in the wrong place. She had felt the weight of a pause in conversation where a confession might have sat, had anyone asked the right question. "Bring her here," she said softly to Miss Graves, indicating the lawn's bench beneath the wisteria. "The shade will steady her, and cold water will wake more truth than speculation." As the small cluster formed to assist Mrs. Cartwright, a whisper of unease slipped through the party like a thin draft beneath a doorstop, barely noticed unless one was attentive enough to feel its chill. Miss Marple's eyes, behind their mild and unassuming expression, locked for a fraction of a second with Lady Penelope's. The older woman's smile had thinned. Something in her gaze was not comfort but calculation, as if the fainting were a crack in a carefully maintained facade, either a weakness to mend or a misstep to exploit. The garden party, in the space of a few breaths, had shifted from its steady rhythm. The tea had cooled in cups forgotten. Conversation stuttered into cautious murmurs, and in that gathering pause, beneath polite exclamations of concern, Miss Marple began to hear the first notes of a discordant refrain, one that, if left unattended, would strain the whole village into revealing a secret none of them had intended to share. Chapter 2. Whispers and Uneasy Alignments. Mrs. Cartwright's color returned, not with the suddenness of revival, but with the measured bleed of someone who had been sketched in faint lines and was now being retraced. Miss Lillian Graves fanned her gently with a paper program from the church brass band's upcoming recital, while Reverend Ashdown murmured soft assurances about nothing more than a momentary weakness, though his hands, too, betrayed the tremor of a man seeking something in the air that would explain what had just shifted it. Lady Penelope hovered nearby, her posture composed but her eyes restless, taking in the faces assembled around the bench as if they were pieces on a board, and she were calculating whose move would come next. Gerald, having stepped back to allow propriety its place, whispered something to his sister that Miss Marple did not hear, but the tiny nod Lady Penelope gave in response had the quiet sharpness of a blade's edge. The older women clustered in the shadows of the wisteria, their murmurs winding in quiet skeins. "She's not one to faint," Mrs. Fenn observed, her voice almost a hiss. "Not unless something has been stirred." Mrs. Bishop, who ran the village haberdashery and prided herself on knowing which threads of rumor would fray next, added, "There's a smell of old trouble in the air. It's the sort that collects and waits, like dust behind the mantel." Miss Marple, still sitting, had let the others bustle. Her gaze, however, was not lost. She turned her attention to Mrs. Cartwright herself, whose breath now settled into a shaky steadiness. The diary, still pressed to the thin chest beneath the blouse, had not moved. It was as if the small, leather-bound book carried a weight beyond its size, one that had refused to be detached from its keeper, even in that moment of collapse. The ribbon that bound it had been looped in a careful knot. Someone had, in recent weeks perhaps, unknotted it and tied it again with a slight unevenness. Miss Marple's fingers twitched once, almost reflexively, as if she could have traced the pattern without touching. "Everyone should sit a while," Miss Marple said, her voice a soft wind that settled upon the group. "A sudden weakness is better spoken of than silenced by worry. Mrs. Cartwright, dear, do you remember what came over you just before it happened? Was there a smell, a word, a sound that seemed out of place?" Mrs. Cartwright, pale but alert, blinked slowly. Her gaze traveled from the vicar to the new schoolmistress, to Lady Penelope, lingering there a little too long, as if the polished surface of the older woman's composure reflected something she could not quite name. "It was nothing," she whispered, then stopped. The word hung like a broken promise. She pressed her hand to the diary, and the fingers that had once enforced discipline in classrooms now shook, not with weakness, but with a restrained agitation that made her knuckles white. "Nothing often carries the most weight," Miss Marple observed, her tone casual, almost playful, as though she were commenting on the weather. "But if you think of something, anything, do speak. We all oversimplify to keep our peace, and sometimes it's the simplicity we didn't question that carries the truth." Miss Lillian Graves, who had so far acted mostly on instinct, leaned closer. "Mrs. Cartwright, you were telling me about the school's old registers, about a certain family's name being struck out, weren't you? You said you'd almost forgotten who had done that years ago." Mrs. Cartwright's lips pursed. Names disappear. People swap them like cards. Her voice, thinner than before, had acquired a brittle edge. "I was thinking of the new gate. It's solid, yes, but when you stand beneath it and listen, you hear things not meant to be heard. I thought the mortar was shifting, but the wall spoke, if walls can in their way. I thought I heard a breath. I thought it was the wind." Timothy Waller, who had drifted back toward the group under the gentle pretense of pretending to fuss with the ribbon on Lady Penelope's hat, now found his attention drawn. He stepped forward with that awkward ease of a man trying to seem helpful, while keeping his own internal ledger neatly folded. "Perhaps," he offered, "the wall is older than the gate. Memory settles into stone. Mrs. Cartwright, you were always one to look deeper than most. It's a good thing, isn't it, to pay attention. Things are not always as tidy as they appear." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, not in disapproval, but in calculation. Timothy's phrasing came with an almost rehearsed softness, like someone who had spent too much time learning to sound concerned. He had, she now realized, drifted closer to the wall earlier, not by coincidence, and now he was positioning himself as the man who could explain it away. It was a small alignment of movement. The more observant might have noted the sudden straightening of his shoulders when Mrs. Cartwright mentioned sound, the way his eyes flicked toward Lady Penelope, as if seeking validation for the reassurance he offered. "Stone remembers more than we give it credit for," Miss Marple said, And sometimes what we think we hear in the cracks is what someone intends us to hear. It's not always the wall speaking, dear Timothy. Sometimes it's the silence around it. Timothy's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough to make the casual eye think he was simply looking at the roses. Gerald, standing slightly apart, and now pretending to be engaged with the arrangement of the sandwiches, had his own interest. He listened with that practiced stillness that concealed whether he truly heard or merely allowed sound to pass through like a well-trained echo. Lady Penelope's hand, resting on the edge of the bench, curled a little around the frame. No one would have called it a grip, but it had the quality of someone bracing just enough to control something they felt might slip. Word rippled through the party. The initial concern over Mrs. Cartwright's fainting had branched into a cautious curiosity. The children, sensing the adults' shift, slowed their own chase, glancing with the strange solemnity of those too young to understand, but old enough to feel the cool draft under a doorstop. Mrs. Bishop murmured to Mrs. Fenn just loud enough for Miss Marple to catch. "It's as if someone shook the tree lightly to see which fruits would fall. Too light to be noticed, but enough to disturb the hidden nests." "Did you hear about Timothy's family?" Mrs. Fenn added under her breath. "His father had he disappeared years ago in some scandal involving a missing heirloom. Timothy's always had that look, like he's carrying something too heavy to mention. So he carries it by pretending it's light." Miss Marple did not comment. She merely made a small mental note. Heirloom, disappearance, the pattern of absence carried forward in a son's measured words. Her attention, though, shifted again, back toward Mrs. Cartwright's diary. She was aware now that the old headmistress was not simply unwell, she was unsettled. Something had disrupted the quiet anchoring of her mind, something that had listened and then recoiled. That recoil had been the fainting. But the bruise beneath it was not physical. It was a bruise made by realization, or, perhaps, by fear of having been close to something she believed herself too wise to miss. "What did you hear about the gate?" Lady Penelope asked, her voice deceptively light. "You said the wall spoke. Walls don't often gossip, do they? Unless someone listens too closely." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes lifted to Lady Penelope, and in that lift there was a moment, a hesitation, as if she were weighing whether to speak truth or to let the silence remain a small, protective veil. "Some voices," she said slowly, "are meant to be carried by the wind, not by the stone. I might have heard a whisper. Or I might have been hearing the past trying to set itself straight. The difference is subtle, but it makes all the difference. Gerald, who had been pretending to examine a fleur-de-lis-shaped sugar tongs, dipped his head. "You've always had a way with stories, Mrs. Cartwright," he said, a courteous deflection, "but perhaps it's best we don't read too much into a passing fancy. Spring settles into summer, and with it, things calm." Miss Marple's eyes, however, glided to Lady Penelope. The older woman's smile did not waver, but her fingers, now subtly, tapped the bench twice. Soft, deliberate. A habit, a small rhythm, a mark that perhaps, when taken with everything else, was a way of setting herself against the current, seeking control. The murmur of consent, of nervous agreement began to gather steam, not toward clarity, but toward assumption. The obvious discomfort in Timothy's face mingled with Lady Penelope's poised alertness, and the idea of the wall whispering became, to the less attentive, a quaint story, one to soften over with more tea, and later to pass on as the sort of notion that belonged to garden parties. Miss Marple, though, heard the way the sound of that agreement was too smooth, like fresh varnish over a crack. She stood, finally, as the others settled into their own versions of the truth, and walked with the measured pace of someone who was not racing to answer, but drawing a circle around the next shape. "Reverend," she said, catching his eye as he offered more brandy to Mrs. Cartwright's nurse, "would you, when you have a moment, ask Mr. Hargreaves to bring me a shard of the old mortar from that end? It's nothing, merely a curiosity. I always find that the things one is given without request tell more than the things one demands." He blinked, a little taken aback at the simplicity of the request, and nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I shall send for it at once." As the small groups drifted back into their positions, some staying close to Mrs. Cartwright, others retreating, as if the news of a fainting had altered the boundaries of intimacy, a new consciousness took root in Little Renford. The garden party had not yet produced scandal, but a new tension had settled, a quiet alignment of eyes, of interests, of histories. The morning's calm had splintered into differing interpretations, all of which would be tested and reformed, some gently, some with a pressure that would deepen the hidden fractures. Miss Marple, moving slowly toward the far wall as if to examine the roses again, paused. Her fingers did not touch the stone. She did not need to. She had already begun to hear what the garden might say if it was asked the right question. She had placed the first careful seed of her own inquiry, that the wall, the whispered breath, the fainting, and the mannered concern of certain individuals were not disconnected. They were threads of a design, and the pattern, still incomplete, began taking shape in the spaces between what people claimed to know and what they kept too closely to themselves. Chapter 3. The Mortar and the Measure of Silence. The shard of old mortar arrived in a small, chipped saucer, carried with deferential awkwardness by Mr. Hargreaves himself. He laid it on the low garden table, as if placing a relic, then hovered, fingers interlocked, waiting to see if the interest would flower into direction. The fragment was crumbled at one edge, the lime and grit worn smooth by time. In the shallow crevices, darkened residue clung like the memory of a conversation long since faded. Miss Marple accepted the saucer with a softness that made the gesture seem incidental, then lifted the fragment as one might inspect a pressed flower. She turned it so that the light caught the worn ridges and traced her thumb along the faint line that seemed, if one permitted imagination to step in, like a seam where two stories met. There was nothing dramatic, no hidden inscription, no smear of recent disturbance. But she had it in her mind that it wasn't the visible surface that carried the first proof. It was what lay beneath the expectations of that surface, the way a pattern affected behavior without announcing itself. "Has the gate been opened lately?" she asked the gardener, eyes still on the shard, as though the question came because the mortar had spoken it into her hand. "Always, Miss Marple," Mr. Hargreaves replied, his dialect soft and careful. "Folks come and go." Lady Penelope had that new plaque placed. Her brother insisted it be set just so. Timothy Waller has been asking about the old deeds, and I've seen him near the wall more than once when he was only passing. And the wind's been stiff enough that it whistles through the corner if one leaves it open. But the gate? It's been shut proper, same as always. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The sound, the whistle, the passing, those were small things, like the way a well-trained dog's ears flicked before a storm. She set the shard gently back in the saucer. "Sometimes we think a place is closed, when in truth it has only been given a polite front," she murmured. "Noise can be a shape, and silence can be the space around a secret. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves. You may go." He bowed slightly, retreating with the professional distance of a man who recognized observation without being the object of it. The others around the party watched this quiet exchange from a step removed, trading their own glances, some curious, some merely entertained by the continued ripple of intrigue. Gerald, who had been standing at the far side of the table, now approached, ostensibly to take the saucer, but really to lean in just enough to catch the subtlest shift in Miss Marple's expression. "You're very thorough," he said, his tone a blend of genuine admiration and the mild suspicion one reserves for skill that might reveal too much. "It's only that each thing in a garden, like each person, likes to be understood in its own small language," Miss Marple replied. "If you listen long enough, you find the grammar, Gerald. The mortar has a sentence that makes those who hear it think they are merely hearing wind." Gerald's smile thinned in a way that did not make it less charming, only more guarded. He drifted away, joining a cluster near the pergola where a fresh topic was being born, this one concerning the upcoming harvest fete, and whether the new schoolmistress should be allowed to supervise the children's displays. The current of conversation shifted, as currents do toward arrangements and responsibilities, but there remained that undercurrent of watchfulness, like the low hum before a distant train passes. Miss Lillian Graves, still attentive and unsettled by the earlier fainting, took the opportunity to sit beside Mrs. Cartwright, who had been coaxed into a shaded chair with iced lemonade pressed gently into her hand. "I've always believed," Miss Graves said, "that memories are like plants. You can uproot them, but they leave roots. Sometimes even broken stems send up shoots when you least expect it." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes returned to her with a warmth that was cautious. "You're very kind, Miss Graves, but we don't always know if what's growing is the same as what was planted. There are things that have been buried not because they were bad, but because they were dangerous. A whisper, whether in a wall or in a mind, can pull at roots that were hidden for safety's sake." Miss Marple, close enough to hear and not intrude, let the exchange remain between the two. She had no need to speak. She was gathering not just what was said, but how it was said, what was chosen and what was omitted. The gesture of Miss Graves's hand, the way she placed her thumb along the edge of the glass to cool it, the slight inclination of Mrs. Cartwright's head when she used the word dangerous, details that, placed side by side, formed a map of concern. Timothy Waller, who had drifted back toward the rose pergola again, now engaged in a conversation with Lady Penelope. The subject was the upcoming village archives, and the question of whether certain records should be opened to public view. Miss Marple overheard the tail end of the exchange. "History is not always a comfort to the present," Lady Penelope said, her voice smooth. "Some things are safer kept tidy, don't you think? We all like stories, just not the ones that crack the edges of what we've built." Timothy's reply was softer. A quiet agreement held more toward seeking than asserting. "People forget what has been done to them by deciding it never happened," he said. "It's easier to keep peace when you let the past lie undisturbed." Miss Marple's attention slipped briefly to the way Lady Penelope's bracelet caught the light. 3 small, identical twists in the silver, spaced just so, with one of the twists slightly duller than the others. It was the kind of small imperfection that someone who counted her life in careful habits would not have allowed by accident. The duller twist was on the side closest to the heart when she rested her hand atop her lap, a small detail of placement that suggested awareness, intentional or not, of its difference. Gerald, watching from across the lawn, sipped his tea slowly, his gaze moving in a pattern that traced Miss Marple's motion, then retreated, as if to test the honesty of what he had seen. His presence had become a quiet pressure, not of intrusion, but a measure of whether the conversation had shifted in ways that would force open a seam too quickly. The faint clink of a spoon against porcelain broke the tension, as if the ordinary were attempting to reassert itself. The vicar, summoning a smile, proposed to the remaining gathered that perhaps the music for the upcoming fete, played by the brass band from the next town, could include a piece of something cheerful to lift spirits. After all, he added, with the quaint optimism of someone who believed words themselves had healing, a village that listens to its hearth's murmurs cannot forget to tend the fire. Miss Marple, however, did not respond to the cheer. Her thoughts were turning inward, not to the party's surface, but to the pattern she'd begun mapping. Timothy's earlier anxiety around sound, the fainting of the woman who had once held the village's memory, Lady Penelope's calculated composure, the quiet involvement of Gerald, and the gate that had been given the polite impression of closure, while its wall had become a stage for whispers. She rose then, unhurried, and crossed the way toward the entrance of the herb garden, where a narrow path skirted the yew. She moved as if to stretch her legs, but her eyes were on the small sign bearing the names of plants, the edges slightly worn from fingers of the curious and the forgetful. She paused, not at the gate itself this time, but at the shadow beneath the low stone bench nearby. There, half concealed by the droop of time, lay a fragment of paper, thin, browned at the edges, folded twice. It had not fluttered with the breeze. It had been placed with intention, pressed just enough to keep from being noticed by anyone hurrying past. Miss Marple reached down, lifted the paper with the gentleness reserved for living things, and unfolded it. The script was small, almost hurried, and the top line had been partially rubbed as if someone had tried to make part of it less clear. The rest, however, remained legible enough to give her a pause. It was a note, a name, followed by a time, followed by the phrase, "Do not trust the voice that borrows silence. Meet where the mortar weeps." She folded it again, smoothing it along her palm, and slipped it discreetly into the inner pocket of her cardigan. Her eyes drifted toward the wall, and then, with a calm that masked the quickening of her mind, toward Timothy Waller, Lady Penelope, and the cluster of villagers now caught in their small webs of concern. The paper, the phrase, the place. It was a quiet bridge between what had already been spoken and something waiting to be said in a voice that had not yet been heard. She did not call attention to it. She had planted the seed of observation. Now she would wait to see which roots moved in response. Chapter 4. The Note and the Quiet Ripples. Miss Marple did not speak of the paper. She folded her hands, perhaps to hide the slight tightening of her fingers around a truth that had not yet surfaced. Instead, she wandered back toward the group near the pergola, with the deliberate slowness of someone who had been interrupted mid-thought, carrying in her posture the sense that she had acquired nothing, and yet everything was subtly changed. The discovery of the scrap of paper, tucked beneath time and hidden by habit, made the air around her feel more porous. She could feel the way the villagers' attention, previously stabilizing into easy, self-affirming explanations, now flexed with an uncertainty as if new weight had been placed on a scale whose balance had just been questioned. That note, "Do not trust the voice that borrows silence. Meet where the mortar weeps," was a small strand tying the earlier fainting, the wall's whisper, and an unseen urgency together. It was, in Miss Marple's estimation, too deliberate to be a mere coincidence, yet too furtive to reveal the hand that placed it. Miss Lillian Graves, as if feeling a shift in the atmosphere herself, approached Miss Marple with a polite hesitation that marked her growing unease. "You've been watching," she said conversationally, as though commenting on the weather might soften whatever lay beneath. "Do you think Mrs. Cartwright truly heard something? She says it was a whisper. Yet she speaks as if some part of her is afraid of what it might be." Miss Marple inclined her head. She heard something, yes. Whether it came from the wall or from memory, that is what we shall see. Often it is not the thing itself that does the troubling, but the way someone believes it might have been meant. Her gaze slipped briefly to where Timothy stood with his back to the low yew hedge, speaking in muted tones with Gerald. And sometimes the thing that borrows silence does so to cover a deeper sound. That is the sort of borrowing one must pay attention to. Miss Lillian, earnest and still adjusting to the subtleties of the village's unspoken codes, nodded slowly. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the old-school registers. You mentioned the name that was struck out. Do you think that could tie to what Mrs. Cartwright felt? Perhaps someone is trying to manage which stories live and which are smoothed over." Miss Marple's smile was small and faint, the kind that suggested approval without confirming agreement. "Stories prefer being remembered in a way that flatters those who told them," she agreed. "But sometimes the erasure leaves a raw edge that rubs, and those who remember the rubbing are the ones who feel the discomfort. That discomfort, Miss Graves, is often a better guide than the story as it is told." Gerald, overhearing and anticipating the direction of the conversation, drifted near with a lightness intended to mask interest. "Perhaps," he interjected, with the mannered casualness of a man lightly skimming a subject, "we could have the archives reviewed before the fete. If people are uneasy with names being kept or removed, transparency would settle the mind. Better to have everything open and explained than to let whispers grow." Lady Penelope's lips curved in a way that made the suggestion seem, on the surface, like generosity. "Oh, Gerald, that would make the town feel as if it were airing its laundry in public. Some things, once washed in broad daylight, never look the same. There's comfort in knowing why a name was struck out, if one knows the story behind it. The danger is in letting imagination fill in what's not there." Timothy's hand, which had been resting against the small of his back, curled slightly around something invisible. Miss Marple thought she saw the tightening, then release of restraint. "The past is not easily unmade," he said quietly, looking at Lady Penelope with something close to deference. "But if the truth brings peace, then perhaps it's better than living with the suspicion that comes of silence." Miss Marple listened. The alignment of Lady Penelope's caution, Gerald's suggestion, Timothy's subtle agitation, it was a small constellation. None of them, on their own, suggested malice. Together, they wove a texture of concern that could be either protective or suffocating, depending on the intention threaded through it. A new disturbance came more quietly, like a breath taken and held just beneath hearing. One of the younger women, Mrs. Pritchard, who ran the village tea shop, came hurrying from the path, her apron slightly askew, as though the movement had been sudden. Her cheeks were flushed, and her body carried the kind of urgency that usually belonged to news that had already begun to alter perception. "They've found it," she announced, coming to a stop beside the table. Her voice, low but urgent, drew attention as effectively as any high note in a song. Mrs. Cartwright's little silver pencil. It was in the rose bed, near the wall. Gerald found it when he went to pick up the sugar bowl. He says it was hidden beneath the leaves, as if someone had placed it there in a hurry and then tried to cover it with petals. A hush crept, not so much as a silence, but an expectation. The pencil had been Mrs. Cartwright's, thin, engraved with her initials in a modest script, and used for marking the registers in a time when a correction could change a family's entire relation to the village's memory. It was a small instrument, yet in the right hands and with the right history, it became a vessel for orders, erasures, and the quiet power to set things otherwise. Hidden. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Was it broken, or did it appear whole? Gerald, caught by the attention, held the pencil with a delicate restraint. Whole, he said. Very clean, except for a little soil on one end. It looks as if it had been placed there recently, not fallen or lost. Someone wanted it to be found, perhaps, or someone wanted it taken, then hidden, then replaced. I thought it odd to see it there, by the wall. Timothy had stepped back a little, as if the discovery pulled a line between him and the others. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers drummed lightly against his thigh, barely discernible. Lady Penelope, however, did not look surprised. Her eyes narrowed in a way that was subtle, as if she were trying to see through a fog without breathing it in. Miss Lillian Graves moved closer to Mrs. Cartwright, whose face had gone a little pale again, not from faintness this time, but from a quiet agitation. Her fingers involuntarily touched the place where the diary lay beneath her bodice. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said in a voice softened by concern, "you said something was dangerous being remembered. Do you think someone's been trying to remind you, or someone else, of that danger?" Mrs. Cartwright's eyes, sharp once more with the clarity of someone who had been startled into recollection, fixed on the pencil. "That's the one I used to mark the wrong names," she whispered. "It belonged in my hand. I put it away last week. I could have sworn I put it in the little velvet pouch. Her voice faltered. "I remember hearing a footstep near the wall. I thought it was only the wind. I felt something cold brush the back of my neck, and then I heard the whisper. I thought I was foolish. And then it was gone. I didn't mean to set it where Gerald found it. I thought perhaps I'd misplaced it." Miss Marple's eyes moved from the pencil to Mrs. Cartwright, then to the low stone wall and the yew hedge beyond. "Displacement can be a trick," she murmured. "Sometimes the mind hides something from itself, as gently as someone hides an object from another. But an object hidden and then revealed has a story of its own, one that bends depending on who is watching." Gerald handed the pencil carefully to Mrs. Cartwright, who took it as if it were a small, brittle truth. She held it for a moment, turning it with thin, capable fingers, then set it, with a quiet decisiveness, into the little velvet pouch she now swore she had not seen disturbed. Her breath became slow, measured. She seemed to be bracing herself for something she had both expected and feared. Lady Penelope stepped forward. "Does anyone think," she said, her voice curated with that same composed weight, "that perhaps this is not a small thing? Perhaps the pencil, used to erase a name, is a symbol. Someone is worrying at the edges of what we've all taken for granted. The fainting, the whisper, the note, and now this. It's like a gentle tapping, testing which window will open if pushed." Timothy finally spoke. "Sometimes," he said, People test without meaning harm. They push, and they find a reaction. That doesn't mean the push was intended to injure. Miss Marple's smile was quiet. Intentions are who we tell ourselves we are. Effects are what the rest of us must reckon with. The difference, Timothy, is a landscape. The same stone can create shelter or a stumbling block, depending on how it is set. The murmur that followed Lady Penelope's assessment was different now. It carried the weight of speculation not yet formed into conviction. Some leaned toward the idea that a past slight had been reawakened, others toward a carelessness that the village, in its forgiving customs, might smooth over. Miss Marple, meanwhile, held the note in her mind like a small compass needle, and around it the newly found pencil became another point, one that insisted the whisper had not been an accident, that someone was drawing attention without revealing shape. The afternoon sun moved lower. Shadows lengthened like cautious fingers creeping across the lawn, and with their growth, the village's normal cadence began to feel as if it were being played in a slightly altered key. Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the conversation, turned once more toward the wall. Her hand brushed, very lightly, the warm curve of the stone, not to test it, but to feel if anything had shifted since she last looked. The mortar, as far as sight could tell, remained the same. But her own internal measure had changed. The ripples were growing. Chapter 5. The Quiet Inquiry. The sun, having begun its gentle decline, gave the garden a softer wash. The edges of shadow lengthened, not dramatically, but in that steady, almost imperceptible way that made familiar things seem slightly shifted. The party had not dissolved, but the easy hum of social lightness had settled into a series of smaller, tauter currents. Conversations branched into cautious tributaries, each avoiding the deep pool at the center, where the note, the pencil, and the whisper had stirred. Miss Marple did not rejoin the main group outright. Instead, she drifted toward the small stone path leading to the herb garden, her movement casual as one collecting stray petals, yet purposeful in its undercurrent. Timothy Waller, who had been lingering nearby with that careful neutrality he wore like a comfortable coat, found himself drawn, almost by instinct, into her orbit. It was the sort of gentle gravitational pull a village offered when two people shared the same space long enough to develop an unspoken alignment. "Mr. Waller," she said, turning as if surprised by him, "you seemed so interested in the archives earlier. I was thinking perhaps you might help me with something small. I was curious if the rhythm of the mortar's settling changes with the day's warmth. I've been told by Mr. Hargreaves that the gate is firm, but I think it pays to measure the sound it gives when one leans upon it. It's a peculiar thing. Some people hear the creak and think the wood speaks. I like to know what the stone replies." Timothy half smiled, that practiced softness again, and stepped toward the wall. "Of course, Miss Marple. It's the sort of thing one notices if one listens. I spent a good while near it earlier. I can help." She motioned with one delicate finger to the small slab of stone beneath the yew. "Just lean there," she said, "as if you are admiring the roses. Do you mind closing your eyes for a moment? Sometimes sound arranges itself differently when the sight is not lending its own suggestions. Tell me what you hear, and then, when you open them, I'll ask you how you felt about the silence." He obliged. For a moment he appeared comfortable. Eyes closed, shoulders easing into the casual pose she suggested. Miss Marple watched the subtle changes in his expression as the seconds passed. His lips moved slightly, as if forming thoughts silently. Then his fingers, resting where the stone met the brick, tensed just a little and released. When he opened his eyes, his glance flicked briefly toward the hedge, then back to her. "It's quiet," he said. "There's the faintest hum, like the space between breaths." I thought at first it was just the wind threading through the corner, but then there's a pause. It's as if the silence has weight, not absence. I felt a little pressure, not from the stone, but from listening to it, like someone waiting to see if you'd hear the same thing they did. Miss Marple's nod was slight. "And when you had your eyes closed, did the silence feel the same as when they were open?" He hesitated. "Different," he admitted. "With eyes closed, it was less shaped." I felt less inclined to assign a cause. When I had them open, I thought I saw movement. Nothing real, perhaps, but it made the silence sound sharper. She let the pause sit between them. "Thank you, Timothy. It is good to know what the stone gives and what we give it in return." She stepped back, leaving him to fold the impressions into whatever private ledger he used. Miss Marple did not push further. She had not expected a confession. What she sought was the texture of his reaction, his attempt to frame ambiguity into speech, the way the silence became something he could name when given a space to do so. It was a small test, a soft cage to reveal whether the borrowing of silence came with the comfort of control or the twitch of concealment. As he drifted away, the gentle performance over, Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Cartwright, who had, for the first time since the pencil had been returned, seemed to settle into something like a cautious steadiness. The old headmistress was now quiet, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze moving not with the sharpness of immediate recall, but with the fogged reflection of something half-remembered. The diary lay within her reach, its binding appearing, if possible, ever more significant now that the pencil, its instrument of alteration, had returned. "Mrs. Cartwright," Miss Marple said lightly, "you've carried the village's memory for many years. Sometimes, when a name is rubbed out, the erasure leaves a shape in the mind like a footprint in soft ground. If you think of the family you once mentioned, one whose name was struck and then wasn't, does the shape of it feel more like a gap or a pressure?" Mrs. Cartwright's laugh came, thin but not unkind. "Always so careful with your questions, Jane," she replied, using the name her schoolgirls had once whispered when they thought her sternness softened. "It is a pressure. There is a name that used to sit like a chair beside another. Now it's only there when you look from a certain angle, and the tilt is wrong. It was the Ainsworths. The father, Edmund, I think. He was a quiet sort, but the sort of quiet that contains a current. One of his daughters was little then, and the name was removed after the scandal. Or was it the mother? The memory shifts like a pattern in a tapestry when you trace it. I know there was resentment, and I know someone used to write to him, trying to get the name back, that someone I can't place without the sound." Miss Marple's eyes, kind but sharp, rested on the slight wrinkle between the old woman's brows, the crease formed not by age alone, but by effort. "And the scandal," she said, "was a quiet one? Not a shouted guilt, but a settling, a rearranging of who belonged and who was sent to the edges?" "A quiet one," Mrs. Cartwright agreed. "That's the kind that leaves the worst bruises, hidden by the polite act of forgetting." Her gaze drifted almost unconsciously to Lady Penelope, who was speaking with a small group near the far fountain, the silver bracelet on her wrist catching the light in a soft, rhythmic flicker as she gestured. People are not good at letting things go when they've been carefully placed. They tug at the threads just enough to feel them, and then they fold them over again to keep their hands from showing. Miss Marple's lips tighten just enough to suggest a shadow of amusement. Yes, they do like to keep the appearance of order, but sometimes the tug leaves a mark. One can follow those marks if one is patient. The sound of laughter, too bright and too sharp, cut across the terrace. The children, having been coaxed back into play by their mothers, who now watched with something like polite vigilance, had been given new constraints. They darted about, but their play was edged with the small seriousness they borrowed from the adults' unease. Little Elsie Pritchard, who had the bothersome habit of listening when she thought she wasn't, crept near the hedgerow and pretended to pick at a sprig of rosemary, while her ears twitched toward the conversation. She was old enough to notice, and young enough to not fully understand why the adults' faces were taut. Gerald, having moved again closer to Lady Penelope, now cast a glance toward Miss Marple, as if measuring whether the small inquiry she had undertaken would bend the direction of the day. He did not interrupt, he waited. That waiting, Miss Marple knew, was intentional. He was testing whether her circle of observation would expand to include something he did not want to bring forward, or whether it was content with its current edges. A new sound, barely more than the rustle of a gown, caught Miss Marple's attention. Miss Lillian Graves had withdrawn slightly from the older women and was conversing in low tones with Reverend Ashdown. Their conversation was too quiet for most to hear, but their body language spelled a shared concern that did not yet have shape. Miss Marple moved toward them with the same softness as a wind shifting a lace curtain, and paused just enough to catch the trailing phrase. And if there is pressure from those who prefer the past, remain tidy, Miss Graves was saying, then perhaps the fate should wait. We cannot put a bonnet on a broken hat and call it new. Reverend Ashdown's reply was gentle. We cannot let suspicion become the one thing that binds us tighter than loyalty. But I admit, he added, in that rare moment when the vicar's voice showed a crease of private uncertainty, I have not been comfortable with how quickly things were smoothed before. Maybe the name should be examined, but not in a way that looks like a hunt. We need a way to ask without making anyone feel accused. Miss Marple stepped closer. Sometimes, she said, the way to ask is not by bringing the matter fully into the light, but by offering the shadow a chance to move of its own accord. You do not need to drag the name into view to see who twitches when it is mentioned. Reverend Ashdown's glance flicked to her, a small gratitude shining faintly in the kind of man who had spent his life believing comfort came from certainty. Miss Graves' expression softened with a slow comprehension, her respect deepening not for the finding, but the care of the inquiry. Miss Marple lingered, then withdrew with the same ease. The afternoon was thinning. Whatever was to come had not yet been touched fully, but its edges were clearer. She carried the sound of the wall, the faint pressure Timothy had described, the shape of the name that pressed like a remembered chair, and the way the old headmistress had referenced keeping things hidden for safety's sake. The small test with Timothy had given her a pattern of response. The conversation with Mrs. Cartwright had given her a tangle she could begin to tease apart gently. And the most vital thread, she knew, was not one loudly pulled, but the one that, when touched faintly, caused others to shift almost imperceptibly in ways that revealed their true alignment. Chapter 6. A Quiet Theft and a Rip in Confidence. The steady haze of late afternoon settled over Little Renford, like the soft sigh that follows the closing of a book. In the garden, The earlier sharpness of scrutiny dulled into a heavier, more cautious attention. The social rhythm had shifted. The party, no longer a simple gathering of neighbors, but a lattice of glances, half-phrases, and guarded kindness. Miss Marple moved through it as a thread through fabric, not tugging, only feeling where tension gathered and where the weave threatened to loosen. Mrs. Cartwright, having been gently coaxed back into color through quiet conversation and the careful administration of lemonade, sat a little apart now, fingers resting over the small velvet pouch in her lap. The pencil lay inside, its presence a quiet anchor. Her eyes, which had once darted and reflected, now drifted like someone watching a familiar path, waiting for the next footstep, but unsure whether to recognize it or to pretend not to. Miss Lillian Graves stood at the fringes of a cluster that included Reverend Ashdown and a few of the elder women. Her expression had the soft focus of someone perplexed by an image that seemed to change when not directly looked at. "We want to do it gently," she was saying, "but if we do nothing, the undercurrent will swell. The question, Reverend, is how to bring small pressure without making it feel like an accusation. That's the difference between healing and hurting." He nodded, his hands folded with the old automatic comfort of a man who believed prayer might smooth edges. "Perhaps we begin," he offered quietly, "with a conversation about the past, an open day for those who wish to share. Not a public examination, but a communal remembering. Let the Ainsworth name be spoken in context. If the truth is what eases, it will settle. If not, it will show where the unrest lies." Miss Marple had been close enough to hear, and a step removed from seeming to listen. "And if," she said, "some names shift uncomfortably when spoken, you will notice the twitch, Reverend. That twitch is the real thing that tells you what is being held too tightly. It's not the speaking, it's the reaction to the memory of speaking that reveals the fracture." Before Reverend Ashdown could answer, a new note entered the day, a small dissonance that had not drama enough to be a scandal, but enough to tilt the edge of trust. Little Elsie Pritchard, who had been playing near the lower terrace and pretending to arrange fallen petals into crowns, came running past with the determined gait of someone with an important secret. She did not rush noisily. Instead, she carried herself with the seriousness of a child who had stumbled on a truth adults would gloss over. "Miss Marple," she cried, stopping just short of the older woman. "Miss Marple, someone took Mrs. Fenn's silver teaspoon. It was in the drawer by the lemonade, and now it's gone. The drawer was closed, but the spoon's missing. Becky said she saw Mr. Waller near the table. And then Lady Penelope was asking Mrs. Fenn about the new recipes. They all said it was nothing, but the spoon is gone. Becky thinks the girl who helps in the kitchen, May, moved it, but May says she didn't touch it. She says she was in the back with the new aprons." Miss Marple glanced toward the lemonade table. Mrs. Fenn, who had been sitting with her hands folded around a cup, now had a small frown, knitting her brow. She had been the picture of officious calm earlier. But the missing teaspoon, a small, harmless thing in most eyes, had the quality of a cracked mirror in hers. "That spoon," she said, "was part of the set Mr. Fenn's grandmother left us. Little things get lost in a crowd, yes, but to vanish like that, when people were there, it feels like someone is looking to see who notices without drawing the obvious." Timothy Waller, who had been passing nearby with a decaffeinated lemonade in hand, paused mid-step. His expression, which up until then had been smoothed into the complacent neutrality of a man comfortable in the margin, slid just slightly, enough that Miss Marple caught it. A tiny tightening around the mouth, the brief flicker of a thought entertaining the possibility of being watched. Lady Penelope, who was close by with a small group discussing the placement of decorative ribbons for the fete, raised her head gently, offering a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Gerald, across the way, observed with the steady neutrality of someone cataloging reaction. "Has anyone looked in the other drawers?" Miss Marple asked, her voice the same soft cadence that made questions seem like casual remarks. Sometimes, when something disappears, it is the person nearest the space who will look least, believing the object to be where it was last seen. And if it's not there, then the next question is who wanted us to think it had merely shifted. Mrs. Fenn's hands fluttered in mild agitation. "I checked. I could have sworn the spoon was by the lemonade, shining as it always does. May says she was in the storeroom with the linens. Becky saw Timothy, but she said he was adjusting the napkins. Lady Penelope was near asking about the recipe for lemon cakes. We all have our reasons to be near things, don't we? It's as if someone is making us look at one place while the other is being taken." Miss Lillian, who had been listening, stepped closer. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "we could have a quiet search, not to accuse, merely to see if the missing spoon turns up in a place we forgot to look. Sometimes objects move themselves into the places they wish to be found, or not found at all." Gerald, approaching with the nonchalance of someone offering help, added, "I can help. A missing teaspoon is hardly a sign of conspiracy, but it does give one pause. People do odd things when they're nervous. I'd rather we know it was a mistake than let suspicion settle like dust." Lady Penelope's voice, when she replied, had that same polished cadence as before. "Oh, of course. We wouldn't want an innocent oversight to become a festering doubt. Let us be thorough, but not make spectacle. If it's truly missing, the attention we give it will find it, either by the spoon returning or by making the person who took it feel the weight of scrutiny." Miss Marple's eyes, moving quietly from one face to another, considered. The theft, or disappearance, of a spoon might have been dismissed as nothing if simple. Yet here, in a day already strewn with whispers and small disturbances, it became a mirror held up to intent, a borrowed silence, the shifting of old names, the fainting, the hidden note, and now a missing utensil. Each was a small stone in a path that, when followed, might not reveal the full destination, but would certainly show who was willing to disturb it, to see whether someone walked it with them. She turned to Timothy. "Would you mind, Mr. Waller, if you and I took a moment to see the other places a spoon might be, where the eye would not look first? I'm curious how easy it is to make something disappear in plain sight." Her tone was unassuming. The suggestion sounded like an invitation to share curiosity, not suspicion. Timothy, with a seeming ease, nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'd like to help. It's the sort of small thing that, when understood, makes larger things clearer." As they walked toward the lemonade table, with careful steps, Miss Marple's mind worked in those quiet, precise movements that had become her way of assembling the invisible. The missing spoon would either resurface in a place of forgetfulness, or force someone to rearrange their own narrative to account for its loss. In the meantime, the action had bent the cluster of concerns slightly, bringing Timothy again closer to a small point of inquiry, and making the watchers, those who had aligned earlier, shift ever so gently, as if repositioning themselves in anticipation of what would be seen next. The garden, which had held its breath through the earlier fainting and the discovery of the pencil, now exhaled in small puffs. each whisper of wind across the roses carrying the potential of a new note, a new misalignment, a new revelation waiting not in a shout, but in the way someone's fingers lingered too long over a cup, or how a glance lasted just a fraction too long. Miss Marple, walking beside Timothy, did not hurry. She understood that the missing teaspoon had not yet told its story, but the way it had been noticed, and by whom, already had. Chapter 7. Threads of movement. Miss Marple and Timothy moved with the careful economy of two people performing an ordinary task while carrying the weight of observation beneath it. They began where the spoon had been last seen, by the lemonade table, but not at the obvious surface. Timothy, under her quiet direction, opened the small side drawer of the serving stand. It contained neatly folded napkins, a coil of twine, and a few forgotten sugar tongs, but no teaspoon. Miss Marple gently lifted each napkin in turn, smoothing them back with the practiced consideration of someone handling someone else's habits. The drawer, like many things in Little Renford, gave nothing loud. The absence felt deliberate enough to have been placed, or else carefully preserved. They traced the route the spoon might have taken had it been removed, and then laid aside to be found, under a small folded tablecloth near the base of the fountain. A faint smudge of darkish residue caught Miss Marple's eye, not the kind that screamed of guilt, but one that suggested touch. It was on the edge of the cloth, near where someone with clean hands might have brushed against it while pretending to look elsewhere. She lifted the cloth and held it up between her and the light. There, just where a fingertip would have rested, was the dullest sheen of moisture, dried and slightly discolored, dirt that had been transferred from something not fully cleaned, or perhaps an attempt to disguise a previous smear. It was subtle. Without intention to see it, one would have walked by. "Did you notice anything when you were near here earlier?" Miss Marple asked lightly, lowering the cloth and replacing it with slow precision. Sometimes the missing thing reveals itself not by where it is, but by the shade it leaves behind. Timothy glanced toward the small pool of water at the fountain's heart, then to the path leading from the pergola. "I was near here," he admitted, adjusting the napkins, as Mrs. Fenn kneaded them straight. I didn't see anything unusual." His eyes flicked to the cloth and then away, just enough to show that he had registered the possibility of its significance, while keeping his face under the surface of careless interest. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment longer on the faint mark. Sometimes we see the evidence of a movement before we have the courage to ask about the movement itself, she said. "Thank you, Mr. Waller. Perhaps we should see if the spoon, when taken, leaves any other trace." They extended the search in small increments. Beneath the pitcher stand, inside the small crate of unused biscuit tins, and along the low shelf where the recipe cards lay. Nothing appeared misplaced except for a single, almost imperceptible thread of pale blue linen caught in the carved detail of the foot of the serving stand. It looked as if it had been rubbed there, not torn, the kind of abrasion that happens when fabric brushes steadily against a surface. The color was almost the same as the trim on Lady Penelope's summer apron, an apron she had not been wearing earlier, but whose presence lingered in the memory of a gesture. Miss Marple pinched the thread gently and let it go, allowing it to fall back as if it had never been touched. She did not name it. Instead, she pocketed that small observation as one would tuck away a note to remember a name later. "The spoon has its own quiet roots," she murmured, mostly to herself. "Sometimes a thing is taken to be looked at, then returned, and sometimes it is taken to be watched being missed. The difference is how the person carrying it holds their hands. They drifted toward the small herb bed where Mrs. Pritchard's children had been playing. Little Elsie, who had been listening earlier, now hovered nearby with that peculiar mixture of curiosity and the protective secrecy of a child who knows she has something to share, but is unsure if it is allowed. She stepped forward, holding something in her small fist that she had clearly found after some deliberation. "Miss Marple," she began, "Becky says she saw a bit of cloth fall near the fountain when Lady Penelope was talking to Mrs. Fenn. Becky thought it was from a napkin, but then May said it wasn't. She says it was the same blue as the ribbon that's not on the one Lady Penelope has now. Becky says the ribbon was on the table, and then it wasn't." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That is very good listening, Elsie. Did you see where the bit of cloth went after it fell?" Elsie shook her head. "No. Becky says someone picked it up while the others were talking, and then they went toward the U. But she wasn't sure if that was before or after the spoon went missing. She's not good at keeping things straight when there's a lot of talking." Timothy crouched enough to be at Elsie's level and offered a small smile. "Thank you, little one. You've helped us by remembering. Sometimes the smallest things are the ones grown people forget to carry." Elsie nodded solemnly, then scuttled away, leaving Miss Marple and Timothy with that thread of possibility. The detail, like the faint mark on the napkin, was not proof of anything, but its accumulation. Blue linen, the scent of disrupted order, movement near the fountain, built a quieter scaffold around the missing spoon. It suggested that someone had been near enough to be careful and careless at the same time, pairing attention with the need to keep actions unremarkable. Miss Marple allowed Timothy to speak first. "You've been near enough to the heart of these small disturbances," she said, "and yet you keep a measure of distance. That's good. It means the person who borrows silence believes they are the only one with the key." He folded his hands, considering. "I'm not sure what the key opens," he admitted. "I've been listening. I thought the things might be separate. The pencil, the whisper, the paper, each a small current. I didn't expect a spoon and a bit of cloth to be part of the same tide. Everything is part of a tide if one knows where the ebb and flow begin," Miss Marple replied. "Sometimes a small theft is a test to see if someone notices the missing piece. Sometimes it's a way to get a person to move so that others can watch their reaction. The difference, Timothy, lies in whether the mover feels watched or assumes they are unseen." He nodded again, more slowly this time. "Then should we—" He paused, looking slightly uncertain. "Should we tell Mrs. Fenn we've found these things? She might think I've been meddling." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Not yet. Let the pieces settle a little more. If you bring it to her now, she may look at the spoon as a singular event and miss the pattern. Let her feel the weight of a small absence before you give it more shape. She will notice the cloth, and she will wonder why her mind brought it to her. It will make her think she saw it herself." They moved away from the table, allowing other eyes to drift back toward the arrangements of the fete, while Miss Marple's mind measured the rhythm of the day's accumulated disquiet. Gerald, watching from a respectful distance, had now the sense to look like he was merely adjusting his cuff, while his mind catalogued the two of them. Lady Penelope, across the lawn, was conversing in hushed tones with one of the elder women. Her gaze occasionally shifted toward Miss Marple, lingering a fraction longer than propriety would require. Miss Lillian, having finished her earlier discussion with the vicar, approached the pair with a soft tilt of concern. "I hope the searching is not too intrusive," she said, glancing at the displaced napkin and the faint mark. "I worry our attempts to be gentle may come across as prying. It's a fine line." Miss Marple, with the quiet equanimity that had become her armor, waved a small hand. "Curiosity need not be prying, dear. It's all in how one offers the questions. A question that begins with interest invites sharing. One that begins with accusation shuts doors. You've given the village a space to shift. Now watch who shifts when you mention the name." Miss Lillian's expression softened, a new clarity folding into her previous uncertainty. "I'll think on that," she said, and stepped back, carrying the idea like a small lantern to hold in the dark. The garden's sounds, which had once been the bright chatter of a comfortable gathering, now sounded more like pages turning in a book that someone else was reading with careful fingers. The missing teaspoon, the thread of blue, the faint mark on the napkin, and the earlier whisper had braided into a quiet tension. Miss Marple, standing at a slight remove, held the pattern in her peripheral vision, an arrangement still incomplete, but with more defined spaces between the pieces. She felt, more than saw, the tug at the edges. The village was beginning to test the depths of its own calm, and those who had whispered first were now listening to see which names would echo. Chapter 8. The subtle shift, the day, having softened toward evening, carried an amber stillness that made the garden's edges seem drawn in with a careful line. The parties of conversation, once scattered, now orbited around the small anomalies, each whisper, each glance, moving like a quiet current just beneath the surface. Miss Marple had taken no overt action since the search with Timothy. Instead, she watched the way the others carried their own unease, letting them shape their reactions while she laid her own gentle provocations like seeds, waiting to see which would sprout and which would wither under scrutiny. It was Lady Penelope who first felt the shift, though she would not have named it so. She had excused herself from the cluster near the fountain, under the pretense of inspecting the arrangements for the fete ribbons, and made her way toward the walled end of the garden where the yew met the stone. She claimed to be seeking a breath of cooler air. The truth was, she wished, in a small, quiet moment, to assess the field before further moves were made. In the curved shadow beneath the low ledge of the wall, she found a tiny envelope, cream, unmarked save for the faintest smudge of damp at one corner, as if it had been carried close to a hidden place and then retrieved. She did not open it immediately. The pause was deliberate. A slight curling of her fingers around the paper, the pull of the seal without breaking, the way she turned it over as if trying to read the story written in its weight. A minute later, with the same composed calm that had become her shield, she slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of her jacket and moved back as if nothing had occurred. Miss Marple saw, though she did not move toward Lady Penelope. She had been conversing with Reverend Ashdown about the proposed soft public remembering, how to phrase the invitation in a way that suggested community rather than confession, when the older woman passed by. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Lady Penelope's smile was as polished as ever, but there was a shadow beneath it. Her fingers, resting just above the envelope's hidden place, trembled imperceptibly, and then smoothed out, as if reassuring herself that the motion had never occurred. The envelope, when later opened in the privacy of her own drawing room, would contain a single line, written in a careful hand. "Some names are kept because they are dangerous when forgotten. You know which. Speak gently, or the silence will speak louder." That, however, was not yet known to anyone. What was known in the garden was the slight change in Lady Penelope's posture as she returned. Gerald, who had been watching her movement from across the lawn, noticed and adjusted his own position to appear casual. He caught the very edge of her unease, small, like a ripple in fine silk, and made a mental note to observe what the silk would hide next. Miss Marple, having taken in the exchange with the vicar, drifted slightly toward Miss Lillian Graves, who had been standing near the fountain, her hands clasped and her expression folded in that inward contemplation that came from learning how to ask questions without prying. "You've given the people a soft place to speak," Miss Marple said. "Now, watch which of them reaches for the comfort of the familiar, and which of them fidgets when the shape of it shifts." Miss Lillian's gaze followed the direction of Lady Penelope's retreating figure. "She seemed off," she admitted, as if something sat heavier than usual on her shoulders. "I thought perhaps it was the heat, but now, seeing her again, I wonder if the tension is of her own making. Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "what we carry is lighter when we speak it aloud. Other times it is heavier. The difference shows in the way hands move when placed near a pocket." Her glance, unobtrusive, flicked toward Lady Penelope's direction, and then to Gerald's relaxed stance. "And sometimes the ones who watch the most closely are the ones who learn how to hide their own watchfulness best." The evening drew closer. The garden lights had not yet been lit, but the first pale gold of lamps waiting in the house's windows reflected softly across the pond. The children, now corralling themselves into quieter play under parental eyes, had largely been coaxed to the far side, where the flower borders softened their games. Little Elsie, restless with her earlier contribution, had withdrawn to the shade of a hollyhock, whispering excitedly to her mother, who only half listened while examining a list of supplies for the fete. A new ripple entered the day from the direction of the kitchen path. May, the young helper in Mrs. Fenn's tea-room, often quiet and careful as one who walked along the narrow edge of a well-order, approached Miss Marple. Her apron, usually immaculately tied, seemed more rumpled than was her habit. Her face bore the slightly flushed look of someone who had rehearsed a decision before making it. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice low enough that those nearby did not catch the whole, "I don't like what's happening. The spoon. I didn't take it, but I found something in the storeroom, a scrap, blue, like the bit Elsie talked about. I thought it was from the napkins, so I tidied. Then I saw the bit of thread lodged in the carvings of the stand again, and the way Mrs. Fenn looked at me. I feel like I'm in a web I didn't help spin." Miss Marple's expression remained soft, giving May a small space without pushing. "You did very well to come," she said. "When someone feels the strands tightening but isn't sure where they lead, the best step is not to pull them, but to note which ones tug when you breathe. Did you see anyone near the cloth before you picked it up?" May's fingers twisted the hem of her apron. Lady Penelope was near, and then Timothy was adjusting the napkins. I thought maybe I'd misremembered, so I didn't say. I cleaned, and then I saw the shine beneath the stand where the spoon had been. Mrs. Fenn asked if I'd gone near the lemonades. I said yes, but she looked at me like I'd moved something. Her voice fell, small and uncertain. I don't like being watched when I'm only doing what I'm told. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Don't let the watching make you feel guilty for keeping order. You keep things straight, May. That makes you valuable. Keep watching, and when you find something that doesn't fit, tell someone you trust. Not to accuse, but to lay it beside the others and see if it matches. You've done well. May's shoulders eased just a little. "Thank you, Miss Marple." She stepped back, eyes scanning the middle distance, as if looking for the place where the thread of trust had frayed. That evening, the planned, soft, communal remembering was being considered more seriously. Reverend Ashdown, carrying a quiet resolve now mixed with the tension of potential fallout, had agreed to a small prelude, a tea in the church hall where a few chosen villagers would be invited to speak of times gone by, of names that had shifted, not to finger blame, but to honor context. Miss Marple approved the wording, suggesting that the invitation include the phrase, "We gather to share what we remember and how we remember it. No one is asked to confess, only to recall." It was the kind of phrase that would make people comfortable enough to come forward, yet uncomfortable enough that those with something to hide might show the slightest tightness when the subject was brushed close. The evening was close enough that the first of the lamps along the garden path flickered to life, golden bulbs softening the lawn's edges, creating small islands of light. The garden had not yet revealed its deeper fracture, but the cracks were more visible now to eyes that had been trained to see not in the bright colors of the roses, but in the slight shifts of posture, the corners of smiles that did not quite meet, the way a hand lingered near a hidden pocket. Miss Marple stood, quietly apart, letting the conversation flow around her like a calm river. She kept her own thoughts folded. Lady Penelope's hidden letter, May's unease, the bit of blue cloth, Timothy's earlier reaction to silence, and the name of the Ainsworths. Each was a small pressure point, and together they formed a constellation with no single star bright enough to show the full picture, but enough arranged that one could begin to trace the shape of something that had been carefully veiled. She knew the next moment would need to be one that did not force, but invited, a subtle, psychological shift that would test who responded when the unspoken was touched just enough to cause a reaction. Chapter 9. The Invitation and the Unseen Reply. The evening, now fully settled in its quiet gold, made the garden appear less a place of casual meetings and more a stage set for careful action. The lamps along the path threw soft pools of light, and the shadows between them carried the suggestion of corners where something might be left unsaid. The idea of the communal remembering had taken root. Invitations, worded with Miss Marple's gentle precision, were being delivered in small, deliberate batches. The chosen few, those whose names carried weight in the village's layered history, accepted with measured grace, and some with a whisper of resistance, disguised as polite concern. Miss Lillian Graves, having taken Miss Marple's earlier advice to heart, stood beside Reverend Ashdown in the church hall doorway, making final adjustments to the list of attendees. She moved through the room with a quiet determination that had sharpened over the day. "We must be careful," she murmured to the vicar. "If we let them feel the safety of the invitation, they'll come. If we let them sense the nose of accusation, they'll close. It's a narrow path." He nodded. "You've given it a shape, Lillian. I only hope that those who come will bring truth, and not just the most comfortable versions of it." Miss Marple lingered near the edge, her knitting forgotten in a small basket at her feet. She watched Lady Penelope, who had drifted away from the main party under the pretext of speaking with Gerald about the placement of the ribbons, but now stood alone by the wisteria, one hand resting near the soft curve of the trellis, the other absent-mindedly adjusting the duller twist on her bracelet. Her face, in the pools of amber light, was calm, too calm. The letter she had found earlier had already, invisibly, begun to shift her. The line about names kept because they were dangerous had landed not like a threat, but like a reminder of a burden she had chosen to carry. Gerald approached, his conversation a practiced ease. "Everything in place for tomorrow?" he asked lightly, as if asking about ribbons and remembrance were the same. His gaze, however, flicked just enough toward the garden gate to note a small movement there. A figure in the distance, a silhouette of a child pausing as if listening. "I expect the ones we're inviting will come," Lady Penelope replied, her tone balanced delicately between graciousness and an edge that suggested she had already assessed who among them might shift when the name of the Ainsworths was mentioned. "It will be interesting to see which of them hears what they are told, and which of them hears what they fear." Gerald's smile carried a small question. He did not press it. He merely offered, "Shall we ensure the refreshments are arranged so that those who come feel welcomed but not watched?" "Of course," she said, and added, with a softness that felt pitched, "and perhaps a little extra care with the seating. People relax when they think they are comfortable. They move when they feel safe. That movement tells more than the words." Miss Marple, watching the exchange from a few paces away, turned instead toward the bench where Mrs. Cartwright sat, now wrapped in a thin shawl against the creeping coolness. Her diary had been placed beside her on the small table, its leather cover closed, the ribbon tied with the same uneven knot Miss Marple had noted earlier. The old headmistress's hands rested on her lap, her fingers tapping a rhythm absent-mindedly, not unlike someone counting time by the pause between words. Little Elsie, in defiance of curfew murmurs from her mother, had slipped back with a cautious whisper. She crept near Miss Marple, lowering her voice as if the very lamps might overhear. "Miss Marple," she said, "Becky saw Miss Graves give the invitation to Mrs. Bishop." Becky says Mrs. Bishop's eyes went like this. Elsie's small hands widened and then narrowed, and then she smoothed it. "She's coming, but Becky thinks she wants to bring something." She kept looking at Lady Penelope when she said she'd come. Miss Marple's lips lifted a fraction. "That is useful, Elsie. Keep your ears open, and your eyes too. Sometimes it's not the one who brings something who matters most, but the one who watches what they bring." Elsie nodded solemnly and darted away before her mother could catch the alert in her absence. Miss Marple's attention drifted. Then, to the envelope Lady Penelope had tucked away. She did not know its contents, but she knew that now, quietly, the field had changed. The letter would act as a quiet pressure, a reminder placed into a pocket that made every movement slightly calculated. A new, small disturbance came from the direction of the herb garden. May, who earlier had approached with a hesitancy that had set small gears turning, hurried over, her face flushed with more than the exertion of walking. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "Mrs. Fenn asked me to check the guest list again. She's worried. She doesn't want anyone thinking she's making a fuss about the past. She told me to take the invitation to Mrs. Bishop personally and say it was Miss Graves's idea, so she'd feel it came from kindness, not curiosity. I think she's afraid of what talking might pull up, but she doesn't want to—" Her voice broke slightly. "She doesn't want to look foolish." Miss Marple's gaze never faltered. "She's not foolish," she said softly. "She's cautious. The ones who keep order are often the same who fear fracturing it. You gave her a way to give the invitation without making it a demand. That will help. Let her know, through you, that the remembering isn't about fault. It's about placing names gently beside each other and seeing which ones stick. May's shoulders eased and she stepped back, carrying the instruction like a small guardianship. Miss Marple turned then to Mrs. Cartwright. "Did you hear, dear, about the little gathering?" she asked, as if speaking of nothing more than a discussion on harvest times. Mrs. Cartwright's gaze lifted to hers, slow and measured. "Yes," she said. "I remember being asked to recall. I remember thinking the name might be heavy to lift again. I've been turning it in my head like a coin. It doesn't feel like a treasure. It feels," she paused, "like a bruise that no one can see, unless they press just right." Miss Marple nodded. "That's what we'll do. We'll give the bruise a gentle press, enough to make sure it's still there, not so much that it hurts anew. The ones who've shaped it will show their own discomfort when the edges are touched. We're merely offering a cloth, not a knife." The gate at the far end of the garden, which had been polite and closed all day, now had a new watcher, Timothy Waller, standing with hands folded loosely behind him, looking at the people arriving and departing as if he were marking a pattern in their movement. He had not been part of the direct exchange, yet the way his gaze traveled, settling briefly on Mrs. Bishop as she approached, then shifting to Lady Penelope, made Miss Marple aware of a subtle realignment. He, too, was listening for the shape of unease. Across the lawn, Gerald and Lady Penelope shared a look that was unspoken but not unseen. The invitation was a test, and its acceptance a step further into visibility. The evening's crescendo was not a clap or a revelation. It was a slow tightening of the web, each strand being felt for its strength. Miss Marple, knitting now again, not because she needed to, but because keeping her hands moving kept her mind tempered, knew that the next one to move, voluntarily or in defense, would reveal where the tension truly lay. Chapter 10. The Reveal Beneath the Doorstop. Miss Marple had spent the evening stitching the loose edges of the village's unease into a quiet pattern, and now, as the last of the lamps cast their mellow glow across the lawn, she was ready to set the final test. The communal remembering, held in the church hall under the modest pretense of sharing how we remember, had drawn a tight circle of those whose names held weight and those whose silence carried meaning. Mrs. Bishop, Mrs. Fenn, Reverend Ashdown, Miss Lillian Graves, Lady Penelope, Gerald Ashcroft, Timothy Waller, May, and a reluctant Mrs. Cartwright were present. The room smelled faintly of lemon cakes and old wood. The air was taut with what was to come. Miss Marple had asked for an extra chair to be placed opposite the small sideboard where the tea was arranged. The silver teaspoon, now returned to its drawer and polished as if nothing had been wrong, was set casually beside a porcelain dish of sugar cubes. She had, with her usual unobtrusive care, arranged the seating so that Gerald would sit near Lady Penelope, Mrs. Bishop near the door, and Timothy within easy earshot of Mrs. Cartwright. The note she had found beneath the time, the half-cryptic warning, "Do not trust the voice that borrows silence. Meet where the mortar weeps," had been shown, discreetly, to Mrs. Bishop earlier in a quiet aside disguised as concern. It had been the whisper beneath the doorstop she had passed to Miss Marple in the brief moment before the invitations went out. Mrs. Bishop had not spoken of it directly, but her eyes had carried the weight of its worry. And that small exchange had been the nudge that led to this gathering's precise tension. Miss Marple opened the session with quiet warmth. We are not here to accuse, but to listen. Sometimes, to remember, one need only utter a name and watch how it settles or starts. I'd like to begin with something small. Gentlemen and ladies. The Ainsworth's name was struck from the register long ago. I'd like to ask you to think of why it was, and if any of you feel a tightening when I say it again." She pronounced the name deliberately, letting it hang as she subtly observed. Mrs. Bishop, whose own memory of the old scaffolding of secrets intertwined with the strike, did not flinch. Mrs. Fenn's hands, which had been folded tight, relaxed slightly. She had no stake beyond old, small resentments. Lady Penelope's fingers, brushing the worn edge of her chair, trembled just a fraction, but she smoothed them as if to hide it. Timothy's gaze held steady. His discomfort had been mostly in being observed, not in guilt. Gerald, however, caught subtly, almost too late, Miss Marple's attention. His smile, ordinarily so easy, had taken on a brittle edge. His hand, resting near his side, had trailed along the chair's arm in a nervous flick, and in the lamp's glow, a faint thread of pale blue clung to the cuff of his jacket, the same blue that had appeared in the serving-stand's carved foot, the same hue little Elsie had described. Miss Marple let the moment sit, then continued. Names are like small stones dropped in still water. The ripple shows you what lies beneath. Mrs. Bishop, you've been the keeper of patterns most of your life. You once spoke to me of careful erasures. What was the consequence of lifting the edge of one such erasure, if one did it gently? Mrs. Bishop's lips pressed, and she replied, "One risks the truth hurting those who believed they had hidden it safely. Sometimes the person who did the hiding becomes the one most frightened of the unearthing." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, and sometimes, her eyes drifted very softly, the person who tries to keep the hiding in place will take the movement of another, small, inconvenient, and make it a larger distraction. A missing spoon, a bit of blue cloth, a fainting. To the right ear, they are murmurs. To the wrong one, the one who's borrowed silence to hide a deeper echo, they are a threat. It was then that Miss Marple turned to Gerald. "Gerald, you suggested deeper transparency earlier, so generous and yet so particular about comfort. Do you remember the day the Ainsworth name was struck? Or perhaps the day someone came asking for its return, and the refusal was made permanent? Did you see, when the name was touched tonight, a movement in yourself, like someone adjusting the weight of a secret that pressed unexpectedly, the way your sleeve caught on the arm there, revealing the pale blue thread? Does that color feel familiar to you?" Gerald's composure cracked just enough. His jaw tightened and then loosened on a forced breath. Lady Penelope's glance flicked toward him with something like concern, but her eyes, now, had calculation layered beneath. Gerald straightened, offered the practiced laugh that no longer reached his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. It's a bit chilly tonight. Old habits twitch, that's all." Miss Marple's smile was soft. The bit of cloth that was found caught in the stand, the thread that appeared on its foot, the small missing teaspoon. Such trifles, you might think. But you, Gerald, have been watching something you wished to hide behind those trifles. Mrs. Bishop found out about the forged request, about the note you had crafted to influence the restoration of the Ainsworth name to gain favor. You feared exposure. You arranged distractions. Mrs. Cartwright's fainting to unsettle her, the theft of the spoon to draw eyes, and then when Mrs. Bishop persisted, when she threatened to pull at the loose thread, you used the very spoon to poison her tea. You believed a quiet death would be easier sworn to silence than a public unraveling. The room shifted, as if a wind had come through without warning. Mrs. Bishop, who had remained calm, stiffened a fraction, but not from guilt. From the sudden realization that the thing she had quietly suspected had been named aloud. Timothy's lips pressed, and Mrs. Fenn's breath caught. Lady Penelope's face, composed, held the flicker of something like grief for a man she had let move in her circles, her calculation now replaced with the knowledge of his deeper desperation. Gerald stared, then laughed, too sharp. "You've woven a story," he spat. "You take little things and make them mean a great deal. I did not. Mrs. Bishop was going to sully the family's reputation. I only tried to keep a balance. The name was going to ruin more than just pride. I didn't kill her." Miss Marple's eyes turned to Mrs. Bishop slowly. "You would have known, if you had been the one to touch the bruise gently, what kind of pressure would make him crack? You offered him a small kindness by not pressing. He repaid the kindness with fear. Mrs. Bishop, did you tell him you would speak to Lady Penelope? You feared that she would take the Ainsworth name and twist it into leverage, and when you confronted him, he believed your threat to expose the forging would bring ruin. So he acted preemptively, hoping to stop you from speaking." Mrs. Bishop's lips trembled just enough as she replied, "He thought I would give it to the wrong person. I only wanted the record cleared so the truth could be understood. He came to me, offered to help restore it with a story of community good. I saw the thread, too neat, too rehearsed. I told him I'd ask Miss Marple quietly, and he changed. He took the spoon from the drawer. He was the one who'd made sure it was noticed missing, and came with the pretense of helping Mrs. Fenn. I thought perhaps I had misread his manner. Then the tea. He put it there. I didn't suspect until after I'd seen the bruise on Gerald's conscience in the way he adjusted his sleeve when I'd mentioned the name again. I was going to speak gently. He's the one who made it dangerous." Gerald's face blazed with anger and fear. "You're twisting it." "I tried to save the reputation. The scandal would have hurt more than one name. The Ainsworths were already on the edge. You took a life," Miss Marple interrupted quietly and precisely, "and hid behind small noises to keep others from hearing the sound of your own stepping. The poison you used was subtle, something that mimicked the faint fatigue of shock applied to the sugar in the tea. You thought the missing teaspoon would cover your tracks because it could be blamed on careless children or distracted hosts. But the tug in your fingers, the pale blue thread from your cuff, caught when you fumbled in the pretense of adjusting a napkin, was the same color as the apron trim Lady Penelope once wore when you asked her to ask Mrs. Bishop to meet. You believed she would keep it quiet. You were wrong." Gerald flung himself up, chair scraping. "I didn't mean—" "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You meant to prevent the unraveling of a story you had begun by another quiet lie. You didn't intend murder in the grand theatrical sense. You intended it as a gentle closing of a door. Sometimes, however, the gentlest hand can leave the deepest scar." Reverend Ashdown, who had been watching with a quiet horror, stepped forward. "Gerald Ashcroft," he said, "I ask you, no more lies. The village deserves the truth, and so does the one you silenced." Gerald's resistance crumpled. His shoulders sagged. He looked toward Lady Penelope, and the brief flicker of a plea crossed his face. But she only inclined her head slightly, not rescuing, not condemning, merely acknowledging that the game had been played and the pieces laid bare. I thought," he whispered, "if the name stayed buried, the pain would not spread. They were dangerous, those who wanted to bring it up. Dangerous because it would It would change everything. I didn't want to lose what we had built. She threatened to tell, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. You lost something already, Gerald. What you built was on sand. The truth, when given a chance, does not spread ruin. It gives direction. You could have let the name be examined and placed. Instead, you made it a weapon by trying to control its telling. That is why you were afraid of a whisper, because it was the first sign you would not be the one to shape the end. The room held its breath. Gerald's face went pale, then red, then hollow. He slumped into the chair, unable to meet the eyes of those who had watched the quiet disturbances as pieces of a whole. Miss Marple turned finally to Lady Penelope. You received a letter, she said softly, a reminder that some names are dangerous if forgotten, and that silence, if left to swell, will speak louder. You now know why. You have choices. The one who kept the letter hidden has the chance to decide whether to let it soften or harden the fractures further. Lady Penelope's gaze was steady. I will not undo what's been done, she said, but I will see to it that the name is placed gently. The truth, at last, can rest without being a threat. Miss Marple looked around the room one last time. The village will return to its pattern, she offered, but it will not be the same. Those who heard themselves in the whisper will flee from it, and those who ignored it will be the ones who think they kept peace. Remember this, the quietest hands are not always the kindest, but they are the ones that leave marks. We'll let the proper authorities take Gerald. He will answer for what he did, and the Ainsworth name will be spoken of, not hidden. Mrs. Bishop, I'm sorry you were harmed in trying to keep justice simple. Mrs. Bishop nodded. Her strength returned not from the indignity of being near death, but from the satisfaction of having, at last, pulled the right thread. Mrs. Cartwright, having listened, did not speak. She closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. Timothy, who had watched the reveal with the quiet tension of someone who had been drawn in by curiosity but not guilt, exhaled slowly, as if releasing the hold he had kept on his own silence. The gathering dispersed in a silence that was not heavy, but thoughtful. Outside, the garden seemed to sigh, a small wind stirring the wisteria leaves as if in approval. Miss Marple stayed behind a moment longer with Mrs. Bishop, offering a small cup of tea, this time without silver spoons in the cup, while the vicar prepared to notify the proper authorities. Later, as the village settled and the moon lifted pale and honest above the hedges, Miss Marple walked the garden path alone. She paused at the low stone wall where the mortar had been a stage for whispers. She placed her hand lightly against the cool surface, not to test it again, but to thank it for the stories it had held. In that quiet, she folded the day's events into the calm she carried, knowing the fracture had been seen, the name had been lifted, and the whisper beneath the doorstop would no longer carry the same weight.